Welcome to the Productivity Podcast. Delighted to be joined today by Richard McElroy. Richard's worked for one of the big four supermarkets and also the UK's biggest hospitality company. Hi, Richard. How you doing?
Morning, Simon. Yeah, I'm great. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Good. So before we get into the detail, because today we're going to talk about some of the roles you've done historically, which are really interesting to me, having worked in head offices and in retail. We're going to talk first about being a category director. What is it? How does it work? But before we get into the detail of that, it'd be good if you can just give us a bit of career background of what you've done since you left school, college, and where you've got to.
Yeah, so I left school, and I think like a lot of people, I kind of fell into going to college and studying hospitality back in the late 80s, and did that for 5 years. I was fortunate enough to do what in those days was a national diploma, and then I did a high national diploma. And again, in those days, you could convert that into a degree. So I ended up going to Huddersfield University. I think it was the Polytechnic, actually, when I started, and it was a uni when I finished, and converted that into a degree. So I was fortunate enough to do a national diploma, a higher national diploma, and then a degree, all in hospitality management. I then went travelling to Australia, came back, and ended up working in an independent restaurant and wine bar in a village in Cheshire, which was absolutely fantastic. Brilliant 5 years. And learnt there really the importance of just building relationships with people and having, great conversations with everybody in that, in that environment. We used to have people from the world of sport, music, television, film, and then you'd also have local people as well. And the ability to build relationships and treat everybody equally was really important in that environment. And I had a brilliant 5 years. But then made kind of, I guess some would say, a slightly strange step to go from, again, what was a brilliant independent wine bar in a beautiful village in Cheshire. Then I went to work for TGI Fridays. But TGI Fridays, I'd always identified, I was a fan. I love Fridays from a customer point of view. But what it gave was real structure and rigour around processes, around standards. They were fantastic at training, and I joined TGI's in 1998 when it was part of Whitbread, and I worked for TGI's for about 8 years, both in the north, and then I moved and ran Lakeside, and then ultimately I ended up running as the general manager of Blue Water, which at the time was the busiest TGI Fridays in the world. Some would say helped by the dollar conversion at the time. I think it was back in the heady days of 2 for 1 pound to dollar. But yeah, it was the busiest TGI's in the world. It became apparent, I think, by probably 2004-05, so probably a couple of years before I did leave Fridays, that Whitbread probably would exit TGI Fridays. And Whitbread was a big reason why I joined TGI's. They had lots of brands, growing brands, things like Costa, Premier Inn, their pub restaurant division, David Lloyd. But it was clear, I think, that Fridays was going to exit, and it did. So I made the decision to leave and went to work for Starbucks. I was there just for about a year, based in the city. So my district was Canary Wharf, which was a great place to work. You think about productivity. Nowhere was productivity more important than when the Jubilee line delivered thousands of commuters in the morning. We absolutely had to be on our A game. And I ran, I think there was about 6 within the Canary Wharf complex. And then they started to expand. That district started to expand out into the O2, Stratford. Before that happened, I left Starbucks and rejoined Whitbread and joined Costa. A lot of the guys that I'd worked for within TGI's had moved over into Costa. And Costa at the time, people kind of forget now, because everyone looks at Costa as kind of this huge sort of, number one coffee shop retailer in the UK. At the time, Starbucks was significantly ahead of Costa in terms of number of units and probably in terms of kind of innovation and product for the customer. But I saw something in the people in the leadership team in Costa and was excited to join. Costa went on a huge transformation. They had a great plan, great people. And every single week we opened more and more stores. I can remember in head office in Whitbread, we used to have a kind of a leaderboard of how many stores we had. And every single week we opened more and more, and we got closer and closer to Starbucks. And then I can remember now, there was a tipping point when we overtook Starbucks as the number one coffee shop retailer in the UK in terms of number of stores. I can remember Costa going on the telly for the first time, doing their barista adverts. So that was hugely exciting. Great time. I was there for a couple of years. and then got the opportunity to join Whitbread's restaurant division, which again, was probably underinvested, I think it's fair to say. But again, there was a plan and a vision and an investment to transform their restaurant division. They called it a rejuvenation program, and that was as much about rejuvenating the kind of physical environment as much actually it was about rejuvenating the team, through real sort of engagement, training, incentives, etc. So that saw not a growth in terms of the number of pub restaurants, because actually most of the pub restaurants were co-located next to the Premier Inn, but it did see growth in terms of covers volume, sales volumes, profit volumes, which meant we could invest back into the teams. It meant we could invest in training, people development, etc. So, a brilliant time in Whitbread Restaurants. I ended up becoming the ops director for Brewers Fayre, and then became the national ops director for Whitbread Restaurants, which was, accountable for 415 of their branded pub restaurants across the UK. So things like Beefeater, Table, and Brewers Fayre. A couple of other smaller brands, which people may or may not be aware of, Bar and Block, which I think is continuing to grow. That's their kind of steak proposition, which they're opening alongside their Premier Inn opening. So, yeah, I was there until 2019, and I left at a point where Costa was sold to Coke. I was on the restaurant and Premier Inn exec at that time, and I guess the structure just needed to look very different moving forward. And it was a good time for me to go and do something different, take all of the great experiences that I'd had and take them to a different organisation and take a completely different direction really in my career. I then joined Morrison's. I had several conversations with people from Morrison's, with David Potts, the CEO, with Trevor, who was the CFO, and Claire, who was the HR director as well. And I joined Morrison's as a category director of their food services division, which was twofold really. The first part of it was the category director for their cafe and coffee. So I think they had around about 400 cafes and barista bars as well. I think they had about 80 barista bars. So that was kind of one half of the category directorship that I led. The other half was all their food to go and some of their fresh counters. So things like their meal deal food to go sandwich that you see at the front of the store fitted into that category. Things like their salad bar, which was hugely popular, their pizza counter, which again was hugely popular, their chicken pies, and then their pies and pastries and snacking. So quite a diverse category, significantly important to Morrison's, both in terms of sales, but also in terms of profit. But also, I think the cafe is really important, or was really important to Morrison's in terms of from a community aspect. I think it gave a halo effect to the overall store. A well-run cafe was really important, a great meeting point for people. And clearly their food to go, was significantly important when you think about some of those other key competitors, things like, Greggs or some of the kind of high street grab and go offers out there, coffee shop retailers, etc. Hugely competitive, but hugely important. So, yeah, that's kind of a whirlwind tour of where I am, where I am now. That's kind of where I've been majority of my career in hospitality, and then latterly moving into retail. Very, very different, both hugely enjoyable, both really rewarding, both very challenging. I would say that retail compared to hospitality, retail moves significantly quicker. Decision making, certainly my experience, was really, really quick. We would make a decision on a Monday, and by Tuesday we would be, we'd be going live with something. So whereas probably in hospitality there was a lot of test and learn, I would say that my experience of retail was much more, you would test and learn, but you would do it actually whilst you were live with the products across probably the majority of the trading estate. And it wasn't because we didn't value the customer. It was actually because we felt we could get far better insight by being live with something out in the market, because the customer would very quickly tell you in terms of the way that they shop that product. So we would get, our information as data really from the sales numbers or from customer sentiment. We would learn very quickly. We would refine. Yeah, and very different, I guess, in that respect from the hospitality business, which probably I found the biggest difference was probably just the pace within retail. Think about launching of products and, range, and we'll talk probably a little bit more about what a category director actually does. But certainly, you think about some of the brands that are out there now, Lidl, Aldi, Iceland. I saw the other day, again, promoting some of their newer products and things, Greggs, the Co-op, etc. So yeah, very, very challenging, but hugely rewarding.
So coffee and food have featured quite heavily then in your career so far, it's fair to say? Yes,
pretty much all of my career really has been coffee, food and alcohol. And I've always said to people, who couldn't get excited about working in those areas. Coffee, I think, the exponential growth of coffee in the UK being unbelievable, and yet we are still hugely behind places like the US in terms of how much coffee we actually consume. So I think that will continue to grow, and I think it's great to see. One of the positives of lockdown has been probably the return to the high street and people returning to use their local coffee shop operators. And whilst I've worked for big brands like Morrison's and like Whitbread, Costa, etc., I am a huge supporter of supporting local businesses in towns and villages up and down the UK. So I think that's been, really great to see, and how they've adapted and modified their business model, to be able to do takeaway, etc., I think has been great. But yeah, food, drink has been, all that I've known really within my career. Who wouldn't love that as a career? It's not like we're selling life insurance or funeral plans. I think there's far worse sort of career path that people could choose.
Yeah, absolutely. So, category director. Then I've worked in lots of retail organisations, and there's been category managers, category directors, and they all used to sit on a different floor to the kind of operational teams. I kind of thought I knew what they did. I was never quite sure. So it'd be good for you to give us kind of a whistle-stop tour of what the role of a category director does, how it influences the business, and some of the kind of decisions and choices that you have to make.
Yeah, it was always really clear, and certainly I can only speak from my experience in Morrison's. It was always made really clear that commercial, which is where the category directors sit, they sit in the commercial team. It was always really clear that the commercial team was kind of, the driving force, the engine room, I guess, of the business. They are absolutely critical to the success of the organisation, alongside the support functions, of course, that go with that. But clearly, the category directors and then the people that sit within those teams. So, the category managers, the buyers, the buying assistants, etc. They do make decisions. We made decisions on things like range. So, what products would we list? What would the distribution of those products look like? Is it across every single store, or does it vary by demographics? We would also think about space allocation. So, how much of that product would we put on the shelf? How many would we allocate from a space point of view? We would make decisions on pricing. We would think about what promotions that we were going to run. So we would think about, everything from what's the product, how much space are we going to allocate to that product, what's the distribution, what's the pricing strategy, what's our promotional effectiveness. What would also be critical would be to establish relationships with suppliers. So clearly building really solid relationships with suppliers so that you could really tap into their innovation pipeline, so you could differentiate potentially from the competition. And you would own the P&L from kind of top to bottom. You would be accountable for the sales performance and the margin performance of that category. So you would need to be able to make decisions based on, you'd need to have strong analytical skills. You would need to be able to buy really well. You would need to be able to think about how much of that product you're going to sell, because clearly what you wouldn't want to do is either have too little and then you've clearly missed the sales opportunity, or have too much and potentially then have a waste challenge, and therefore you'll either dilute margin and or cap sales. So as a lot of retailers tend to do, is then you've got the problem of markdowns, which is where you discount products either at the end of the day or the end of the week. depending on what that product is. Certainly I worked in the fresh part of the category. So again, I can only speak from my personal experience, but you would have the fresh category directors, which would be all of the fresh categories. So things like bakery, meat, fish, seafood, produce, which is fruit and vegetables predominantly. And then you'd have the ambient category directors, so things like, beers, wines and spirits, household, pet, etc., etc. So from that point of view, the fresh category directors, it is really challenging to make sure you get that balance absolutely right between having the right amount of product and not having too much that ends up then becoming a waste challenge in the future. But yeah, again, hugely exciting, because you are literally sort of making decisions there and then that you would see live in the store probably within 24 hours, sometimes less if it was, we tried to limit the amount of price changes that we would make. To manually change the pricing on the shelf edge actually is quite a big task. So we would try and do that as infrequently as possible. But the fact that you could turn on promotions really quickly, work with suppliers, procure more products, and then have it out in the shelves probably within 2 to 3 days, again, I think would surprise a lot of people with just the pace that you have to work in that environment.
Yeah, no, it sounds really exciting, and again, interesting. A couple of things just to circle back on there. So the point around, I suppose, space and ranging, are you competing with the other categories to get more space in the store to sell your products, or are you all allocated kind of certain proportions of whatever a standard store looks like?
Yes, you would have your standard allocation, but then you would have you would have discussions with some of the other category directors, and there would be a facilitator in that as well, in terms of then who takes some of those gondola ends that you see in supermarkets and what promotions you're going to run on them as well. So yes, there was always a slight challenge around how much space you would allocate and who would get that space, whether it would be a beers, wines and spirit promotion, or whether it would be a fresh promotion, but trying to keep it as simple as possible. And I think, this is just my observation from, now being a customer of lots of different retailers. I think that what you see is they try and now make sure that it's as clean and uncluttered as possible. And actually, I think Tesco's have done quite a big piece of work about reducing range and working out that actually people will switch into alternative products rather than abandon that purchase. So I think, examples that people used to give were things like how many different types of olive oil do you need in a particular supermarket. So I think lots of supermarkets have done lots of work on what is the ideal number of products that you need to range, and then how much space you need to, to allocate to each of those products, because otherwise it does become it's a bit of a race to who can just stock the most products, which is not always the most effective way to run that category or to run the overall supermarket.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think our local supermarket, I won't name the brand, has gone mad for tomato ketchup. There's like 4 foot and 40 different types of tomato ketchup that clearly are quite fashionable at the moment. And the other thing that I thought was quite interesting was the whole piece around innovation and creative thinking, or giving yourself some competitive edge. Is that all driven from relationships with suppliers, or are there other angles? Do you have other people in the business that are looking for what's next, where the trends are going, what maybe is the next product innovation?
Yeah, it's both really, Simon. I think the danger is not being too far ahead of the curve, because clearly, you then get left with products you do see. And again, without naming supermarkets and retailers, you do see products that are launched that you kind of think, oh, where does that fit? And it will have a very small niche sort of following. So I think it is finding the right balance. It is working with suppliers. It is trying to be creative and innovative, but it's doing it because it's responding to a customer need or a customer expectation, or something that you believe, it is coming, in the future, and you just want to be ahead of that. I think you have to be careful, though, that you're not filling and taking up space with innovation that actually the customer won't buy. And a lot of it then ends up, one of the big challenges for any retailer is then waste, and that then becomes a big problem from a margin point of view, but also just from an ethical point of view in terms of food waste. Is high on the agenda, I think, of all retailers, given the challenges we've got currently in the world. So yes, I think it's working in tandem with suppliers and your own internal teams to think about, new and innovative products. It might also just be about making products better. So I think, again, probably without naming particular retailers, but you think, there's been a big shift towards things like premiumization. And that actually is a parallel that I saw in the hospitality world as well, this whole idea of premiumizing products. And I think you see a lot of things like best ever and, our kind of special range. And I think you see that both in restaurant or on restaurant menus, but you also see that in supermarkets now, where there's this premiumization. You can have a product, but actually you can have a number of tiers within that, and you can actually then have a good, better, best sort of range within that product. I don't know if you've seen that as well, just from your own experiences when you're out shopping, but that's kind of where I've seen a big shift both in retailers and in restaurants.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in the current times, in lockdown, out of lockdown, just this whole last 12 months, I suspect people are treating themselves a bit more, and certainly will as we head towards Christmas because of the year it's been. So the premium best range, whatever you want to call it, I suspect will be in for some significant growth, just because we all want to splash out a little bit at Christmas, maybe because it's not been the greatest year.
Yeah, definitely. I think you definitely see that. And you see that language now on menus, our best ever, whatever it might be. So that's something that, definitely I think we'll see more of. And I think you're right. I think this year in particular, I think people will push what they would ordinarily spend. They'll push it more just because there'll be less spend on going out, depending on what happens at the end of this lockdown. But even so, it's not going to be a normal, in inverted commas, it's not going to be a normal Christmas in terms of going out and parties, etc. So I think the kind of experience at home will become more important to people, and therefore I think people will be prepared to spend more than they ordinarily would do on some of those critical purchases, that they would make.
And you talked in the previous part just around customers, so the innovation piece being driven by changing customer demands. So it must be a really fine line to listen well to customers, clearly to take the data from the things that they're not buying, which result in waste or markdowns, and take their steer, but at the same time almost try and think ahead of them. Might not know where things are going or the trend, and be aware of product or new innovation that's coming. So there must be a real fine balance between being led by the customer for innovation but also driving the innovation.
Yeah, and I think that's the balance that I talked about in terms of being able to experiment and push the boundaries on some, and some will be for a limited time. So you'll do limited time offers, and it won't find its way into mainstream unless you launched a product and actually you launched it and it was for a limited time, but actually it becomes within your top 10 selling, it could be sandwiches or salads or pizzas, whatever it might be, and then actually it finds its way into then kind of the mainstream offer. So that's kind of when I talked about what I found working in retail different from working certainly in restaurants, where we used to change the menu kind of once every 6 months, and we'd pursue, we'd keep going with a menu that might have items on it that don't sell. In retail, it's very different. If you had a product that wasn't selling, you would look to change it much quicker than that. Clearly, you've got contractual obligations with suppliers that you'd have to work through. There's some quite strict governance around relationships with suppliers and what you can and can't do, which is very different from my experiences within hospitality. But yeah, that ability to refine and either expand a range or reduce a range, you can do that much quicker and probably much more sort of dynamically in retail than I experienced in hospitality. I think from speaking to people now within the hospitality and restaurant industry, I think it's much more agile. I think people have challenged now process because of lockdown, and I think people are now saying, why does it take 26 weeks to develop and change a menu? Actually, why can't we do it in 4 to 6 weeks or whatever it might be? Yes, there's processes that organisations have to go through, and there's checks that people have to make from allergens, etc. But I think what lockdown has done is helped people challenge the status quo in terms of some of the pace around getting things done and some of the processes. And I think that will continue. And that to me can only be good for the consumer, because it should mean that the consumer gets really up to date, relevant, outstanding products, whether that's in a retail supermarket or whether it's in a restaurant or any other sort of business like that. So yeah, I think that will be one of the big changes. I think there'll be some consolidation, clearly, certainly in the hospitality and restaurant sector. I think there'll be some consolidation, but I'm really optimistic about how people will come out of lockdown. As I said, I think the return to probably a bit more localized use of the high street, and people really feeling an affinity towards their local high street and independence, I think can only be good. I think clearly big brands have a big part to play, but I think hopefully the support of the local independent operators will continue. I think one of my probably biggest concerns is just the return to some of our bigger cities, in terms of travel. I think back now to my time spent with Starbucks in Canary Wharf. I can't imagine what that must look like at the moment. I think you were saying earlier, you've been in London and just how different it looked and felt. I wonder what people will go back to when they go back to some of these big cities and some of these businesses that have been there for years, and not just in the hospitality business or the retail business, but some of these independent dry cleaners, shoe repairers, tailors, etc., will they still be there? So I think that's probably one of my big concerns for the future, is just what does that look like? On the back of that, though, I do think there'll be a real growth of startups and people really being brave in terms of launching new and exciting concepts. Probably the biggest shift, I suspect, will be trying to work out how you maximize sales in a smaller footprint, therefore making being able to reduce your overheads, whether that's rent rates, employee costs, food costs, etc., but still being able to deliver an outstanding proposition to the customer. I think that will be what will set people apart moving forward.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. I think I've been championing collaboration as well. I think we'll see lots of what would have seemed 12 months, 18 months ago, random collaborations where people will take space within somebody else's building, unit, outlet. Agile, absolutely. So that needs to reinvent change. So what lockdown's shown us probably is that people in hospitality have slimmed down menus, so drinks menus, food menus, but actually they might turn them or have more specials. So it evolves, it keeps us interesting. And there's a guy called Steve Dennis who writes a book called Remarkable Retail, and one of his things is around collapse of the middle, which I think is back to your point of the strong will survive. Unfortunately, there's some brands that sit in the middle which aren't famous for anything. A bog standard Italian restaurant, there's plenty in London that you see, parts of chains are not, and they will have to up the game, be innovative, or they become part of that middle. They're not famous for anything. The food's average, the prices are okay, but actually there's better places a couple of paces down the street to go to. So I think it will challenge people to be better, and I think unfortunately not everybody will survive, but like you say, as a consumer, we'll be left with probably better quality, varying choice. Not sure how it affects the price, but it will be interesting this time next year to see where that whole hospitality sector sits. And clearly we've not touched on things like hotels and what have you, but yeah, interesting times as a consumer. I suspect very, very difficult times as an owner of one or multiple outlets.
Yeah, I think so, and I think my heart goes out to all of those businesses. Nobody wants to see any business fail, because that has implications for the people that work there and beyond. I suspect a consolidation was probably on the cards anyway before COVID, and I think all that's done is just accelerate that consolidation. But I do think there will be lots of opportunities moving forward. I think there'll be lots of startups, like I said, and I think from a consumer point of view, I think it will, in the short to medium term, it will be beneficial to the consumer, because I think people, to your point, will have to be brilliant. That's brilliant propositions, great service, great food, great environments. I went to see a business a couple of weeks ago, not particularly related to hospitality, more leisure. And I was just blown away by the innovation that they'd done. Just it was a business that they'd really thought about making it memorable. Every single part of it was Instagrammable, if that's a word, and they'd really thought about it really carefully, and it was brilliant to see. I was absolutely blown away. I kind of went with fairly low expectations and came away thinking there are some really smart people doing some brilliant things out there, and I think that will only sort of accelerate as we come out of lockdown. I think there's loads of opportunities to do some amazing things like that.
Yeah. We'll watch this space.
Watch this space, yeah.
Yeah, we'll see. Innovation's always at a high in times of darkness, isn't it? People have to think differently and throw away the rule book. Listen, it's been a fantastic chat. I've learned some stuff now. I now know what those teams that used to sit above me in various organisations did. Final question from me then.
They were always the ones that I think people found quite difficult to speak to and challenge. I think people always thought that the commercial teams were quite challenging, but I don't know if that was your experience, but there you go.
I think it's a question of agendas and priorities, I think. Maybe they're not all the same all of the time, but everybody's working to a slightly different brief. Final question from me then, Richard, is what's the best bit of business advice you've ever been given?
Oh, crikey. Well, I don't know if it was advice that I was given, but it's certainly the thing that I've always made decisions based on, which I've always made a decision based on where I think I can add the most value. So throughout my career, all the decisions I've made have never been about the financial benefits that come with it. I've always believed that they will kind of take care of themselves at some point. If you do a great job and work with great people, that part of it will kind of take care of itself. I've always made decisions based on where I genuinely think I can make the biggest impact. And working, what's hugely important to me is the people I work with and for. And I think you look at the decisions that I've made and the choices that I've made. People thought it was really strange when I left nearly 25 years ago, when I left that small independent restaurant and wine bar in Cheshire to go and work for a big brash red and white striped American brand. But that gave me huge opportunities. People genuinely couldn't believe when I left Costa to go and work for Brewers Fayre. People thought I was absolutely mad, even though it was, still part of Whitbread. People thought, why would you leave a business that was growing, that was really innovative, that was, on the high street in Costa to work in a underinvested pub restaurant brand? But, I believed in the leadership and the plan and the people. And again, when I went to work for Morrison's, again, people thought, why would you move out of hospitality? But I learned, a huge amount, some great learnings, great people, great leadership, challenging, innovative, agile, just a great place to work. So that's probably would be my advice would be make decisions based on where you think you can make the biggest contribution, the biggest impact, rather than just chase the pound note all the time.
Brilliant. I love that one. Listen, it's been a pleasure to catch up as always. Thanks for coming on, and we'll speak soon.
Great stuff. Thanks, Simon.